you mentioned like, hey, this is a massive market. This is hugely underserved. This is beyond my friends and a few people who feel like this could be at the root of it. Where have you kind of put that number in terms of impact or people, or even at this point, like the number of people that have already reached out to try to get help through MoldCo? Like, wow, this is maybe even bigger than we thought.
I think the number could be as high as 30 to 40 million Americans.
Welcome back to the Fitt Insider Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Veneri. Today I'm joined by Ariana Thacker, founder and CEO of MoldCo. In this episode, we discuss the company's mission to revolutionize mold toxicity treatment. Ariana shares how her experience with mold exposure led her to start the company. Plus, we talk about the growing awareness of environmental toxins, building evidence-based protocols for treating mold-related illness, and expanding the platform nationwide. Let's get into it. The Fitt Insider Podcast is presented by EGYM. EGYM's smart fitness ecosystem is transforming healthcare through exercise. Combining strength equipment with AI-powered software and corporate wellness platform WellPass, it's leading the shift to proactive, preventative health. Learn more about EGYM's intelligent workout solutions at egym.com. Ariana, welcome to Fitt Insider. Thanks for joining us.
Hi, Joe. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, excited to chat today, and a topic that is really top of mind, I think, for a lot of people. We were just chatting a little bit before I pressed record, but why don't you just kind of take it away from the top? What is MoldCo? Introduce yourself and what you're working on, and then we'll dive into the details.
Awesome. Hi, my name is Ariana, founder and CEO of MoldCo, and I think it's a peculiar place to be the face of mold. So I'm happy to walk you through how I even got here and what is MoldCo. So it was born out of a personal health journey in my Miami home. I was exposed to highly toxic levels of mold, went on for months with mysterious symptoms, not quite making that mold health connection. And then when I did make that connection, it all just clicked. And I was on this path to recovery, and it snowballed into building a company where that's MoldCo, where we're treating patients with mold toxicity. So we have a healthcare platform and providers on our platform and specialized lab testing where we can assess the extent of the health impacts of mold on your body and provide evidence-based treatments. On top of that, we're also advancing the space through R&D initiatives. So we've collected a large biobank. We have some cool R&D projects underway to more in-depth understand the pathophysiology of what is this illness and what are the most effective and safe treatments that we can deliver to patients directly through our platform.
Very important work, very timely, and at least from my perspective, like not super well understood. Like, what is mold toxicity? How do you identify it? How do you even begin to connect those dots? Maybe you can speak to it from personal experience and through the platform and patients that you're already kind of treating, but like, where does that begin? Like, hey, I think something's wrong. Then what?
Yeah, so I would look at this like a checklist. So you have one, environmental exposure, which could be hidden, visible, or using your other sensory cues, like smelling a moldy, earthy smell in your home. Some of the visual signs would be obvious, like you see mold. Okay, now you have a mold issue, but it can be less obvious, like warping and cracking and discoloration. So that's often an issue. Or it could be a hidden mold issue behind your walls, your appliances, and your HVAC system. One of the telltale signs with your HVAC system is seeing dust on the vents. For example, that's mold food, it's organic matter. Water intrusion, you don't have to have like a sizable flooding event or a hurricane to have a mold problem. It could be as innocuous as having like a nail head loose on your roof and then a rainfall event, and then water intrusion happens that way, right? There's a lot of ways that water can enter the home. So this is why it's such a large and prevalent issue. In fact, there was a very large survey of over 12,000 homes looked across the nation of how frequently did homes have a dampness and mold issue, and it was over 50%. And there's other stats by the EPA where 85% of commercial buildings have had prior water damage, 45% have ongoing water damage. The EPA also cites it takes 24 to 48 hours for mold to grow. So that's one bucket. It's the environmental side. And then it's the symptom side. Are you presenting symptoms indicative of a mold-related illness or mold toxicity? It's also known as chronic inflammatory response syndrome or CIRS. The best categorized way that I've seen symptoms set up is something called symptom clusters. So if you Google that online, like biotoxin illness symptom clusters, you'll see all these different boxes with different symptoms, from vertigo to fatigue to aches and pains to even static shocks, frequent urination. You're probably thinking, wow, that's a lot of random symptoms that don't really connect the dots together. And that's right. It's a multi-system, multi-symptom issue that presents. And it's not like you have one or two or three symptoms at a time that are quite acute. It usually shows up as a cluster of several symptoms at a time. Another layer to that is also the biomarker validation piece. And there's different approaches to assessing the health impacts of mold on your body, to whether you've been exposed or not. So, focusing just on the health impacts of mold to your body first, you'll see signs of dysregulation tied to these inflammatory markers. And that shows up as MMP9, MSH, TGF beta 1, C4A. So, these are the most evidence based labs that we've seen to date in support of the health impacts of mold. And that's more from an inflammatory standpoint. Just because you've been exposed doesn't mean you're having health issues. Every person is unique, and the level of exposure can be acute or not, and the duration. There's a lot of different factors to consider when you're looking at that. There's also some debate around urinary mycotoxin tests. It's unclear whether it's ingested or inhaled, but that shows that there is some sort of mold exposure happening some way, somehow. And there's also like a mycotoxin antibody test too, but also unclear how that maps to the health impacts that you would be experiencing. And it's more so, yeah, you probably had mold exposure at some point, but it's such a big issue. So I think the more interesting question is, what's the health impact on your body? So consider it as kind of this like checklist as you're understanding the impacts, but between the exposure and the symptoms indicative of the exposure, that's pretty high signal.
And I'm sure, having personal experience with this, you're going through and having to some extent connect these dots yourself, do the research. You're Googling some of these terms that you're talking about to even get to a place where it's like, hey, these are the steps that I need to take right now. Everything you're saying is from the position of like, you already did that, one, personally, and then two, to start the company. So, what was that experience like in terms of like, what is out there? What is the standard course of treatment, if there is one at this time? And then, like, how did you take what I'm assuming is a broken kind of system or checklist to what is now more formalized with MoldCo?
Yeah. Let me state the problem statement first before the scope of solutions, and then how we're actually pioneering the standard of care in this industry. So, and I think mold is like a big industry, by the way, very fragmented, very overlooked. But let's go through the problem statement just from the health side, because also the environmental side is quite intractable and frustrating too. But health is our jam. So let's just focus there. So one, after you've made the mold health connection, you found mold in your home, you've validated that, okay, you're having symptoms, it's not normal, it's usually tied to some relocation event or post flooding event or some sort of major event like that where you start to have an onset of symptoms. The typical course for a patient that I've seen, they either go to their primary care provider or they go immediately online and look through the Facebook and Reddit groups and read tons of articles and podcasts. Let's just focus on the primary care provider branch for just a moment. So your primary care provider is not going to know how to address that. They're like, oh, is this an asthma or allergy or fungal infection? It's often categorized as these things versus how we see mold exposure. It is obviously those things as well, but how we see mold exposure in terms of the symptoms that we just discussed, it's more innate immune system dysregulation. So your first line of defense going haywire, leading to a state of chronic inflammation. So that's the bigger, more interesting opportunity for us to help patients address. So your primary care provider won't be able to order the labs for you. They're not going to give you the proper medication. At this point, you're like, okay, maybe I'll chat with an immunologist or an allergist or a pulmonologist or a neurologist, just depending on which of your symptoms are spiking, or maybe all of the above. And those are all going to be dead ends as well. And then you're like, well, I saw this Instagram ad for this functional health medicine doctor or integrative medicine specialist. Maybe I'll go to that clinic. And then we open ourselves up to the whole scope of different solutions out there. So there's the more naturopathic solutions, there's the antifungal solutions, which doesn't really make sense with this use case, by the way, after, it's just not the mechanism of action. And then You can see like PK protocols common using like IV drips. We've seen hyperbaric chambers and ozone therapy and mold kits where you're sold supplements, various types of peptides from BPC 157. There's natural binders like zeolite and charcoal and bentonite clay, chlorella. Like the list goes on and on and on for the whole sea of different solutions you have to swim through. As a company, what we've done is approach this by being guided through the Shoemaker Protocol. So this is standing on a body of over 30 years of evidence. A lot of it was published and peer reviewed. We've also acquired a lot of the unpublished works as well. We've also exclusively licensed in a lot of that IP. We were able to go through thousands and thousands of patient history forms and work with the top minds and scientists and pioneers in the space. Dr. Shoemaker is the founding physician of our company. So that's our approach. We just like to see something more evidence based, and that's just a completely different course altogether. So let's say you did land on that solution. You're like, okay, cool. Months in, several tens of thousands of dollars spent, just hours and hours through the Reddit and Facebook groups, trying to discern what's truth versus not. I'm here finally. Okay, where do these providers live? Oh, they're not in my state, or there's a 2-year wait list, or there's a $13,000 retainer, or it's going to cost me $80,000 for the entire year. So there's just turtles all the way down in terms of the problems you have to kind of sift through to get care. And this is very similar to the journey that I personally went through. And that's what strongly motivated starting this company, is just having so much frustration and pain on top of first not really understanding the market. But the more I dug in from with the interesting question, could mold be at the root cause of several of these chronic conditions and health issues for many more people, not just me and a few friends? And it just turned out to be more and more true as went down that separate rabbit hole around market sizing and really detailed customer discovery works and pulling credible publications and resources to just better understand what's going on and the magnitude of this issue.
Anybody who's had any health issue where they go through the traditional medical system and they don't get the answers that they feel like they need, or it's not satisfactory, or they're not getting better, you're just constantly running into these barriers. And personally, the number of times that I've found myself like sitting on a Reddit, not for mold but for other things, you're just like, man, there has to be a better way. And specifically when it comes to this mold exposure and toxicity, and then all the kind of domino effects of chronic disease and inflammation and all the impacts. You mentioned like, hey, this is a massive market, this is hugely underserved, this is beyond my friends and a few people who feel like this could be at the root of it. Where have you kind of put that number in terms of impact or people, or even at this point, like the number of people that have already reached out to try to get help through MoldCo? Like, wow, this is maybe even bigger than we thought.
I think the number could be as high as 30 to 40 million Americans. I think it's a global issue as well. And, how did I arrive at that number? So that's from a few different ways. One, looking at the number of buildings impacted by water damage in these large studies, looking at dampness and mold in different homes, looking at something called HLA haplotype. So our early research is showing 24% of the population may have this genetic susceptibility that consistently shows up in these patients too, where their health outcomes are quite dire once they're exposed. And not only do they stay sick and become really sick, they don't get better even when they're out of the environment. It's a persistent issue. So that was like one cluster. Another cluster was looking at the common comorbidities for these patients too, and then assigning prevalence rates that I thought were more conservative, like 1%, and looking at the literature as well to validate that. Another way I looked at it was just pulling as many like market stats as possible, and it kept converging on these numbers, like in the low tens of millions, like I would say maybe on the low end 15, 20, on the high end 30, 40. So it's just all of these different ways of slicing and dicing the market kept landing here. And it's like there's a podcast as well with Dr. Shoemaker and Jordan Peterson and Dr. McMahon, who's also our medical director, where they were exploring, could obesity be driven by this pervasive mold issue, as well as several of these other conditions as well. So it becomes a really more interesting question to answer, is if mold is at the root cause of these other chronic conditions.
And from like the kind of operator perspective, I'm just thinking about like other folks who are thinking about, you know, bringing a company to market, putting the pieces together, whether they've had a personal experience or they've then identified an opportunity or a gap in a market. You talked about it going from, hey, I had this personal experience and I'm starting to think about it. And how do we do that now? You're talking about, hey, Dr. Shoemaker is the founding, medical officer researcher, and this person, where from that, like, kind of like aha moment of maybe solving it for yourself or even realizing what that root problem was to like, oh, this is how we begin to build out a platform that can put some of these, as you described it, like these protocols together and actually make it like a research driven solution.
Yeah, it wasn't an obvious insight at all. Like if you look at the Shoemaker Protocol, it's quite complex and esoteric. So just understanding how to then translate that into a digital product where it's templatized, it's easy, that's still safe and effective, and understanding the clear patient inclusion exclusion criteria for who can be using that protocol, working alongside these clinical minds, and just doing this in such a thoughtful and detailed way, and then also comparing and contrasting all of the different solutions out there just to make sure that this was the one we wanted to essentially bet the company on, and making sure that the unit economics make sense, and the go-to-market plan and the business model and the right founding team. Like there's a lot of these considerations. And also when I got sick, I was actually running my own VC firm. So that was hard to let go of. Like it took a lot of effort and time to build that. And I had a lot of resistance to starting a company, but I was incubating it initially under the fund and just was like, okay, I need to find a CEO to run this. And I just kept building it while trying to find this person to do this work. And initially that was met with a lot of resistance. There was, when you have a new idea, I think there's always a lot of resistance. And hindsight, it becomes an obvious idea. But initially it's like, oh, what does that even mean? That's so weird. Like, why would you switch careers to do this? That's not really making sense. How do you know about the market, et cetera? So a lot of these like really valid questions come up from friends in your network, and yeah, all the things. But anyway, to answer your question, it was this very iterative process, and removing and stripping down a lot of the unknowns in the company and answering those questions and filling in those gaps with customer discovery research, asking a lot of questions and staying curious.
One of the questions I had was about making this transition from venture capital to starting and running the company. You, as you phrased it earlier, the face of mold, or the the CEO basically of mold. There being, I'm sure, both in your kind of network and broader network, but also personally, like, hey, am I sure I want to do this? Is this the right move? How do I go about doing that? And then also then raising money for this company from somebody who was on the other side of the table, not that long before. Yeah, just anything that you can share about that experience, because I kind of think of it, well, one, as a founder and builder, like, you kind of can see, especially when you have like that personal connection to the problem, like, look, you know it better than anybody because you just kind of lived it. You might not be an expert who studied mold for your entire career up until this point, but you went deep down into that experience and like basically had to solve it for yourself, and then have the realization like, oh wow, there's so many other people who are struggling with this that we can possibly help. But then there's the other side of like, hey, what about everything that I just worked for kind of
Yeah.
previously? Just how do you navigate that?
It was really hard to let go, and I like had several months of resistance to doing that. I was desperately looking for someone else to run the company, and I didn't want to stop progress in the company just because we weren't finding someone, because the bar was quite high, and I was just like, this is so important to me and I'm obsessed. Like I'm putting in just nonstop hours. I don't really have a life outside of MoldCo. Like this is all I do. Mold is all I do, and I just really enjoy it so much. And there just came a point where there was a considerable amount of progress in the company. I was already hiring key team members, and it was bootstrapped this entire time. Like as I'm describing this, we spent less than $60,000 for the first year. I didn't take a salary for like the first 2 years in the company, just trying to get it off the ground. But yeah, I made the hard decision to not continue the fund, and it just became the obvious path for me to just build this. And that's when I decided to raise the pre-seed round, which came together quite fast. Initially, we wanted 1.5, we raised 3. It happened in a matter of weeks. I mean, that was the easiest raise I've ever had to do. And I think, if I'm being honest, I don't know if the investors really connected with the mission and vision and market or any of that. I think they're just making a personal bet. Candidly, I think if I didn't have network access, this would have been an immensely difficult company to raise for. Even though you see all these tropes from investors like, oh, we want to bet on new, bold markets and potential monopoly forming opportunities and innovation and what's new. And we don't do anything like the other guys, but not in reality. Let's be real.
This episode of the Fitt Insider Podcast is brought to you by EGYM. EGYM makes some of the most innovative strength training machines on the market, but that's only one part of their integrated ecosystem. With connected fitness equipment, AI-powered gym software, and a comprehensive corporate wellness offering, it's forging the future of preventative health. Partnering with companies worldwide, EGYM's WellPass program improves employee health by expanding access to premier fitness and health facilities. Upgrading gym floors, EGYM equips every operator with smart equipment and AI tools to create hyper-personalized training plans for every exerciser. Putting it all together, they're transforming healthcare through exercise. Experience the power of EGYM's ecosystem at egym.com. Yeah, it's tough, especially at the pre-seed stage. You have you're personally kind of making this transition. Again, they're betting on you, and you have the kind of access and reputation, which is amazing, and you earned that to be able to do something like this. But back to that point of like in hindsight, it's like, oh yeah, like obviously,
Yeah.
and maybe this is my bias because I'm so close to it on the, kind of environmental toxins and concerns about air quality and like toxic, what's in personal care products, or what emulsifiers are in our food, and like this, the tailwinds behind this like idea of health and wellness more broadly, that it's starting to come into focus in a way that it wasn't probably even 2-3 years ago, as you're talking about when you were starting. How Well, has that impacted the company at all, and are you seeing those tailwinds?
Yeah, so I think a big risk that investors flagged where you have to educate the market, but I pay a lot of attention to momentum, and I was tracking a lot of the social signals, the rate of posting. I was comparing it to hashtag longevity versus hashtag mold and hashtag biohacking, and there were several weeks where these hashtags exceeded longevity and biohacking for mold, and there's just tons of creators producing content, tens of millions of views and comments and reposts, and of course, like entering the mainstream as well is around rare illnesses, chronic conditions, inflammation, peptides. This is now part of the zeitgeist. So it's been an exponential curve in terms of awareness and market understanding, where we're not having to do the heavy lifting around market education. It's actually been quite fluid for us, as well as the celebrities coming out and speaking about mold. Tori Spelling was quite vocal. There's several more celebrities. If you Google it, there's just a long list associated there, and it's even coming out on Netflix and HBO. It's so many different Netflix shows that are new now referencing mold. There was on HBO, Kate Winslet's The Regime. A big centerpiece of that show was around her mold paranoia. So it's permeating culture. Celebrities, influencers, of course, like it's always been a reoccurring theme on Reddit, this like sleeping giant on Reddit, really. So it's just in so many different places where it's not coming into a new market. It's an old market that just hasn't been tapped yet.
And when you think about maybe talking points of making bold bets and monopolistic potential and categories that other people aren't playing in, how do you think that plays out from the MoldCo standpoint? Like, what you getting in at this early stage and maybe forging what the treatment protocols look like and what the research looks like and what the innovation looks like? How do you see that playing out?
Yeah, I mean, exactly how you frame the question. We do want to pioneer the standard of care. We do want to drive the research. It's not being done by academia, biotech, pharma, or mainstream medicine. So, as an entity, I would venture that we know more about this illness than any other entity or research group on the planet. So, there's information asymmetry, and also moving fast to get to the patient as soon as possible. Right. Really understanding the patient needs and being as empathetic as possible, and expanding to these various channels. And now, you're primary in these channels and you become a meme, right? Like it's MoldCo, just MoldCo that if you're feeling sick. So I see this as our trajectory, and this is what we're building towards. And it was fairly ambitious to pair the R&D side on top of the healthcare platform, but there are a lot of unfair advantages that we're able to overcome as a company to just move so much faster and compress the timeline than I think a new kid on the block would be able to. Not to mainly around exclusive licensing of the core IP, understanding how to design the R&D side to be as efficient as possible to get to truth. And on the healthcare platform side, there's a lot of advantages available. So founders that are savvy and understand the right way to design the architecture can actually move quite quickly. So it was around the systems design level and the right partnerships and the right IP structuring to be able to compress what would have been several years, if not impossible, into a much shorter time frame to where we're already treating patients.
It's always interesting to think about when you are, in some ways, disrupting. You mentioned this isn't a new issue; it just hasn't been approached in the way that you have, to this point. Where and how you integrate with or disrupt or reinvent like traditional healthcare and primary care and the research that has been done to this point. How have you thought about that? Like creating something different and new versus like, hey, this is how we kind of leverage what is already there and build upon it.
So the Shoemaker Protocol had this thesis to start with because Dr. Shoemaker, who's an absolute genius and pioneer, and I just so underrated. I don't know how this man doesn't have a Nobel Prize or something. So he leveraged medications that are readily available to treat patients today. So we're not reliant on the FDA categorizing this as a new indication and us discovering a new chemical entity to address this. So he was able to hack the code essentially to find medications readily available today that are also affordable and well tolerated by patients to help them in their recovery journey. So I loved that hypothesis to medicine. I think that was absolutely brilliant. And if we can treat patients today, why wait over a decade and spend tens of millions, if not over $100 million, getting something to market? And why not have it be as affordable and accessible for patients as possible? So these are the legs that our R&D side has to stand on, which is why our entity name is actually the ImmuneCo. The DBA is MoldCo. It is this much broader vision to address this concept of microbial species causing this first line of defense dysregulation, which leads to this chronic state of inflammation. So we're seeing that as well with some of these tick-borne illnesses and long COVID and other even uncharacterized illnesses, which is really interesting. So our approach there is one, obtain as much data as possible, and then two, look at this problem in silico first to be expedient with resources. That includes even high throughput compound screening, and then bring that in vitro. And do we see phenotypic change? And then bring that to patient studies. So the turnaround time for that can be fairly fast versus going through like, a phase 1, 2, 3 pathway through the FDA, leveraging already available compounds and medications to be able to treat patients today versus the rolling tomorrow. Who knows when that'll end up happening. On top of the other major hurdle for this specific illness, it's not really categorized. So, how do we even go through the FDA if we wanted to do that? We would have to take a playbook out of what these longevity companies do, where they file under a different indication because aging isn't recognized as a disease, right? So they file under IPF or something else, like some of these ocular issues. So we would have to probably do IBD or another indication, right? It couldn't be exactly what we wanted to do, and it would then still be an off-label medication, but now with a more higher risk new compound that's unproven, very expensive, long timeline. So if just like from a first principle standpoint, this approach made sense and it was already embedded in Dr. Shoemaker's approach. So we loved it, and we're here to amplify that initial spark of genius.
Yeah, it's super interesting. And you're kind of seeing it play out, not in the sense where, in this case, you're kind of like treating patients. Someone like maybe a Seed Health is a supplement, but they're tackling the microbiome, but they're doing it through a consumer company and product, but also building like a biotech and research aspect hand in hand. And it's, you're not going to, whereas traditionally, like you said, you're going to spend what, 10 plus years developing whatever the treatment is and funding that and investing in it when, well, what about everybody that kind of needs help in the problem that's sitting in front of us right now? So in some ways, if you're able to leverage the, hey, what we have right now, get in market, actually help people collect even more data while you're advancing this standard of care along the way. It's accelerating this much more than if you were kind of on the sideline hoping for the best that entire time.
Absolutely. And also I love Seed's model. I think it's so brilliant from a branding standpoint, how they set up their advisory network, how they're advancing research in something that hasn't been well researched prior. So yes, love them.
Then when you think about, I was going to ask other chronic inflammatory conditions, you kind of spoke to it. Yeah, we think there's potential to tackle that. Do you see that being within and under the MoldCo banner, or is this kind of other paths or brands? You mentioned the name is in, I think, the MuneCo, if that was correct. How do you see that working together?
I mean, this is like the big ambitious idea. Spin out MoldCo, spin out LimeCo, which will also include tick-borne illnesses, and spin out LongCo for long COVID. So that's the vision. So essentially, these storefronts to address these different conditions that sits on top of this R&D division that we've built, where we can start to solve these problems in a very systematic way, in the way just described. That's actually quite resource light, but high ROI and huge if true, if it works. So that's the structure of the company. And, TBD if it makes sense to have the storefronts versus just one cohesive brand being the Immune Co. That's just kind of a bet we're taking right now. I think MoldCo works really well for mold because one, it stands out, it's something you'll remember, but two, you immediately associate that with your current issue. So that's how I see it also connecting with the patient for LimeCo and LongCo. So we'll see. I'm excited to start testing some of that out, but already seeing success with that with MoldCo.
Yeah, super smart and exciting. I think either way, maintaining that immediate connection and recognition with like, oh, that's me. Like that's the thing. I think is going to be important. And like you said, oh, just MoldCo that. Like you want to be that source versus kind of a more ambiguous or Google, like whatever that may mean relative to what people are actually experiencing.
Exactly. And even more exciting if we can hack insurance and pediatric care. So just layering on the business in all these different ways. I'm just really excited to keep building.
So we talked a lot about future forward looking, kind of big picture, see how it plays out, TBD. Coming back as we wrap up the conversation to like today, in terms of what are you looking at as whether it's KPIs with the team or priorities, or hey, this is how we're acquiring customers, like how are you doing the kind of blocking and tackling on a day-to-day basis of an early stage company?
Yeah. So the major North Star for us is delighting our patients. So we have a closed beta right now. It's live in Texas and Florida. So if you're in Texas or Florida, just email us at support@moldco.com and we'll take you through the eligibility process. So that's our North Star. We're working really closely with the patients. I'm looking at every single patient. The entire team has their eyeballs just focused on every single patient going through the platform to make sure that they're having a delightful experience. We're going over and beyond what I imagine is scalable sourcing environmental specialists and answering just any question that's really thrown at us and helping them source phlebotomists and labs and helping them with scheduling. So it is this over and beyond approach. And we're just really focused on that right now. I'd say the platform is now 80% built. Like it's quite functional, it's quite robust. And now we're layering on the additional automated patient journeys and some more fancy integrations that are coming and a lot of the content and branding stuff. So, less the priority one objectives, which are already behind us, and now some of the priority two objectives to delight our patients and just keep, as I said, layering on into the business every day. Just keep adding layers and expanding.
And how are people finding out about you now?
Yeah. So word of mouth has been really powerful, surprisingly, already at this stage. So referrals have been quite strong. We've had a very large wait list as well. So we've been systematically reaching out to the wait list. We've only reached out to I would say, 2% of the wait list so far, and we're already at capacity right now with that. So any new patients reaching out will probably take us about a week or two to then onboard you at the moment. And yeah, I mean, just different conferences and joining podcasts and referrals from friends during the customer discovery process. I met so many people, and now so many people have my phone number and email, and they're reaching out and referring their friends and posting on Reddit. We're getting publicized in some of the groups and Facebook groups. I mean, we have a long list of different experiments and channels, and a lot of these relationships have been built over the last 2 years, like really important anchor people in the community now coming out and endorsing us publicly and telling their patients about us and speaking about us on podcasts and at conferences. So it was just a lot of legwork to meet these people, build these relationships, and continue these relationships in a high touch point way over time. So that's also been really helpful.
And then in the near term, is it just a matter of getting more states online, continuing to get people off the wait list, and then just you mentioned momentum, like building that momentum?
Yeah, so we're already licensing up our providers. We're onboarding or interviewing more providers to onboard, and we'll be starting the nationwide blitz here pretty soon. So that starts probably in 1 or 2 months with our team. So we've just laid down the foundation for that, setting up the different PC entities and legal and regulatory structure that's needed, understanding which states are top priority versus not, understanding collaborative physician rules and independent practice and all the state by state nuance and updating terms and conditions, et cetera. So there's just a very long involved checklist for every single state. So now we understand the rules of the game, and we'll be expanding state by state here soon.
In terms of whether you think maybe the second half of the year or what's top of mind for you, is there anything specific we should look out for? Or is it just a matter of getting more states online, scaling up, and working really hard to do that?
Yeah, something else that we've launched is we want people to understand their health status, whether they work with us or not in our care, under our care. So we've launched labs that are available in almost all 50 states except for New York, New Jersey, Rhode Island. We're still going to hack that. Or that's also another active project we have going on. But you can access the higher signal labs for the health impacts due to mold at access.moldco.com/labs. And it's only $99. So that's through negotiated rates. Normally those panels would be $657, so quite expensive. So significant savings. We don't have much profit at all on that product. It's really just getting people informed about their health, and it includes educational content too, so you don't even need to rely on a medical professional to interpret. So that is purely educational. It's not diagnostic, but you would understand the different biomarkers, what they mean, what's a normal range, how typically providers who are skilled in this type of care interpret the labs, like with the typical reference ranges they use. So all of that's included for free with the lab panel too.
And then with that, if you're just talking about the broader, they want to learn more, get on the wait list, keep an eye out for when maybe their city, state comes online. Is that just the website the best place to point them?
Yeah, and we also have a free guide on our website too. So it includes a detailed DIY checklist, what to consider when sourcing an inspector and a remediator, some tips around dieting and lifestyle when you're going through your own personal mold journey. So that's all included on the guide. That was just tens of hours of research and working with these experts to put that together. So it saves quite a lot of time in your research and completely free. But you can sign up on our waitlist at moldco.com, or you can just go ahead and send us an email. We're very engaging and we respond right away usually. So support at moldco.com.
Cool. We will make sure everything, labs, website, free guide, everything is linked up in the show notes there. Really enjoyed the conversation. I'm super excited to share it and kind of keep tabs on everything you're working on. So thanks for making some time.
Yeah, thank you for your interest and great questions in the space. Really enjoyed it, Joe. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. If you got value from the conversation, please consider subscribing and sharing the podcast with a friend or colleague. It's a massive help. And if you want more content like this, including news and insights on the latest industry developments, subscribe to the Fitt Insider newsletter at insider.fitt.co. And one more thing, you can learn more about our recruiting and consulting services at fitt.co. That's fitt.co. I'll see you here next week.